Hello, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this public lecture here at Queen's University Belfast. The event's hosted by the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice in partnership with the Vice-Chancellor's Office here at Queen's University, and you're all very welcome. I'm Richard English, Director of the Mitchell Institute, and it's a real pleasure for me to introduce and welcome our distinguished speaker tonight. Cassam is Professor of Philosophy at Warwick University and an Honorary Fellow of Keble College, Oxford. He was previously Knightbridge Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge University, Professor of Philosophy at University College London, and Reader in Philosophy at Oxford University. He was a Fellow of Wadham College, Oxford for 18 years, and later a Professorial Fellow of King's College, Cambridge. Professor Cassam is the author of 7 important and original books, including Extremism, a Philosophical Analysis, published by Routledge in 2021, Vices of the Mind, From the Intellectual to the Political, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, and Conspiracy Theories, published by Polity Press in 2019. His research interests include vice epistemology and the philosophy of terrorism and extremism. Tonight he's going to speak on the subject of extremism, a philosophical analysis. After Professor Cassam's lecture, there'll be the opportunity for you all to ask questions. Please do post those questions using the Q&A function on the screens in front of you, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. Please keep those questions coming in, whether during or after the lecture, and it'll be a pleasure to put them to Professor Cassam. But first, Quassim, it's great to welcome you to Queen's University Belfast tonight, and it's a privilege now for me to hand over to our lecturer, Professor Quassim Cassam.
Well, thanks, Richard, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for tuning in to this broadcast. It's a huge pleasure to be doing this at Queen's and not from my front room, which is where I seem to have been doing most of my lecturing recently. So the topic of the lecture today is extremism, which is the subject of a recently published book of mine. I started working on this book 2 or 3 years ago, and in 2020, when I had got about halfway through, there was a news story which some of you might remember. So there is a climate activist organization called Extinction Rebellion, which is committed to non-violent action to deal with the climate emergency. And there was a story in The Guardian that Extinction Rebellion, or XR, had been labelled by British counter-terrorism police as an extremist organisation, or an organisation with an extremist ideology. Well, not surprisingly, XR weren't very happy about this, and they put out a press release saying something along the lines of, why don't the counter-terrorism police stop hassling us and go after the real extremists, namely the fossil fuel companies? So that little exchange, I think, is a good illustration of an obvious point, which is the word extremist is very often used as a term of abuse or a way to delegitimize people whose views one doesn't agree with. And that raises an obvious question, and it's the question which I'm going to be looking at in this talk, which is there actually such a thing as extremism? I mean, is extremism a real thing that we can talk about, or is it just a term of abuse? Is it an analytically useful concept? And if it is an analytically useful concept, how should we understand the content of this concept? So these are some of the questions that I'll be looking at today. And a spoiler alert, I think it is a useful concept. Okay, so here are the 3 questions that I will be focusing on. Okay, the first question is, what is extremism? So what are we talking about when we talk about extremism or describe certain individuals or groups as extremists? Now, of course, I think it's plausible that quite often when people talk about extremists, they just mean terrorists. But the connection between extremism and terrorism is in fact not that obvious when you go into it in a bit more detail. Second, absolutely fundamental question arising from the XR example is, does the concept of extremism help us to understand a real phenomenon? Or is it simply a term of abuse that's used to denigrate opposition to the status quo? The last question is in a way the most interesting question, which is, assuming that extremism is a real thing, is it necessarily a bad thing? Is it bad to be an extremist? So some of you will have read Philip Roth's great novel, American Pastoral. So one of the characters in this novel is a woman called Mary, who becomes involved in the anti-Vietnam protests that were going on during the Johnson administration in America. And at one point, she's having a conversation with her father, Seymour, who's mystified by her ardent political activities. And Mary says to Seymour, sometimes you have to fucking go to the extreme. Sorry, I don't know if one's allowed to say that in this august institution, but in any case, that's what Mary says in the novel. And isn't that just right? I mean, aren't there situations, aren't there circumstances in which one has to fucking go to the extreme? I mean, supposing you were in Ukraine right now dealing with the Russian invasion. I mean, aren't extreme measures called for in that situation? And now, of course, the idea that extremism has an upside is a familiar one. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. said something along these lines, and also the right-wing American politician Barry Goldwater. You've probably all forgotten, but Barry Goldwater was the Republican candidate in the 1964 presidential election. And Goldwater had his speechwriter have him say the following: extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. There's something in that, isn't there? So that's the issue that I'm going to talk about towards the end of today's lecture. All right, so to begin at the beginning, what is extremism? So I think it's helpful to distinguish between three types of extremist, or if you prefer, three types of extremism. So the first type is what I called methods extremism. So a methods extremist is someone who uses or endorses the use of extreme methods in pursuit of their political objectives. Now, obviously, I'm going to have to say something here about what counts as an extreme method. And very often when people think about extreme methods, they just mean violent methods. And I'll talk more about the connection between extreme methods and violence. But the key to focus on here is that I've only talked here about the methods of the methods extremists. I haven't said anything about their ideology. I haven't said anything about their psychology. I've just talked about the methods that they use. So that's methods extremism. And of course, I'm talking here about political extremism. That's why I talk about the pursuit of political objectives. The second type of extremism is ideological extremism. So here I am going to talk about ideology. So an ideological extremist is simply an individual or an organization or perhaps a state that subscribes to an extremist ideology. So we need to figure out what an extremist ideology is and what it is to subscribe to one. But the intuitive idea here is that you can think of ideologies, left and right, for example, as occupying positions in what you might think of as ideological space. So you might think of extremist ideologies as being at this end or at that end of ideological space, and as extremist in virtue of ideological location. So that's ideological extremism. Then the third type of extremism is psychological extremism. So the thought here is this. People sometimes say that, look, being an extremist isn't just about what you believe. Being an extremist is also about how you believe what you believe. Right, so this is the thought that extremists are people whose views might be to the left or to the right or middle of the road, but what makes them extremists is that they hold on to their positions with a particular vehemence or virulence or inflexibility or something like that. So it's not the content of their ideology that makes them extremists. It's rather their mode of holding on to the ideology. So that's, roughly speaking, the intuition behind psychological extremism. So I'm going to spell out that intuition by saying that psychological extremists have what I'm going to call an extremist mindset. And I'll explain the notion of a mindset a bit later on. I mean, clearly the notion of a mindset is going to be quite complicated. All right, so they're the three types of extremism. So clearly what needs to happen next is I need to say more about each of these types of extremism. I also need to look at the relationship between them. I mean, presumably these different types of extremism are related in some ways. So you might think that ideological extremists are maybe more likely to be methods extremists. So I'll look at that issue in a minute. All right, so let's start off with methods extremism. So methods extremists are people who use or endorse the use of extreme methods. And as I've said, when people think about extreme methods, they very often think about violence. However, it seems to me that extreme methods don't have to be violent. There are extreme methods that don't involve the use of violence. And equally, it's at least not obvious that the use of violence in pursuit of political objectives makes you a methods extremist. Okay, so I'm trying to pull apart the notion of an extreme method and violence. So for an example of extreme methods that are non-violent, I turn to Richard here and his book on the IRA. So there's a very striking passage in which he describes the campaign in the early 1980s for political status for IRA prisoners. So there were many aspects to this campaign. The dirty protest was part of it. The aspect I want to highlight, of course, the hunger strikes. Okay, so a number of IRA hunger strikers, in fact, starved themselves to death in pursuit of a political objective. Now, I mean, you might well think, I think it would be reasonable to say that that was an extreme method of pursuing a political objective, but not a violent method, at least not if you understand violence in the ordinary sense of violence, where it involves, bombs and guns and so on. I mean, of course, self-starvation, you do violence to your body in the course of starving yourself to death, but that's a very different kind of violence from planting a bomb in a pub, for example. So there you have an example of an extreme method that's not violent. What about the other way around? Does the use of violence necessarily make you a methods extremist? So I want to remind you of the African National Congress's armed struggle against apartheid in South Africa, an absolutely appalling racist political system which subjugated the majority black population of South Africa. Now, the ANC was engaged in an armed struggle against apartheid, which did involve the use of violence. Indeed, the ANC was responsible for acts of terrorism. Did that make them methods extremists? Well, maybe it did, but we need to think a bit more about that. So from an ANC perspective, the argument might have been something along the following lines. We used violence because we had to use it. It was the only way we had to overturn a grossly unjust system. And the fact that we used violence in these very special circumstances didn't make us extremists. What about the German generals, the Nazi generals who tried to assassinate Hitler with a bomb in a suitcase? I mean, was that an extreme method? Well, that's worth thinking about. Right? I mean, from their point of view, it was the only hope of getting rid of this man who needed to be got rid of. Right? So there are questions here to be addressed. Now, I think there are kind of two broad approaches to the issue of what counts as an extreme method. So one approach is what I call intrinsicalism. It's a barbaric label for a very simple idea. So an intrinsicalist is someone who thinks that whether a method is an extreme method just depends on features of the method itself. Nothing about the context is relevant. So if you think about ISIS beheading its captives, or in one particularly awful case, putting one of their captives in a cage, dousing him with petrol and setting fire to him, the intrinsicalist says that is an extreme method. It doesn't matter what the circumstances were, that's an extreme method. Okay, and that's what the intrinsicalist says. The contextualist has a kind of more nuanced view of the matter, and the contextualist position is the one I want to defend. So the contextualist says, well, yes, of course the method matters, right? And the intrinsic features of the method are relevant, but so are contextual factors. Contextual factors also matter. So what are the relevant contextual factors? Now, I've given the example of the ANC, and there are many other examples of what you might think of as liberation movements that have used violence in pursuit of their political objective. And some of these movements have been anti-colonial movements. And anti-colonial movements have used violence in particular circumstances and for particular reasons. So the contextualist says, if you want to figure out whether a method is violent, and a violent method is extreme or not, you need to ask yourself a whole series of further questions. Okay, so one further question is, was violence employed in a just cause? So the thought here is that we're less inclined to describe the use of violence in a just cause as extremism than its use in an unjust cause. Now, of course, you might want to say, well, yes, but what you think is just is what I think is unjust and vice versa. I think that's just unavoidable in talking about extremism. Of course, the notion of a just cause is a normative notion. It's not purely descriptive, and there's no chance, I think, of being able to say something sensible about what counts as an extreme method without using normative ideas like just cause. Of course, the nature of the violence is also relevant, so I'm not saying that the nature of the violence has nothing to do with it. Of course it does. Another question is, was violence necessary for the objective for which it was being employed? So I think it's much more plausible to describe someone as a methods extremist when they use unnecessary violence. So if you think about Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, in the chapter on violence in that book, chapter 17, a very interesting and subtle discussion. But the take-home message of Mandela is, we tried nonviolence. We tried nonviolence. It didn't work. I mean, nonviolence worked for Gandhi in India. It didn't work for us in South Africa because we were dealing with a different enemy. So Mandela's argument was, well, we used violence because we had to. It was necessary violence. And what's more, what made it necessary was not the fact that we didn't have sufficient support. What made it necessary was the nature of the opposition we were dealing with. Right? So of course you might say, well, I had to use violence to get my way because no one supports me. Well, that would be a reason why violence would be necessary, but that's not the kind of necessary violence I'm talking about. Of course, there's also the issue of proportionality. Was the violence employed proportionate or not? Clearly a very important question, and clearly there's a lot to be said about what counts as proportionate violence. There's also the question of effectiveness. I think that it's very important when we're working out whether to describe someone as an extremist or not in their use of violence, whether the use of violence was likely to be an effective means of achieving their objective. I mean, people can use violence even when there's absolutely no chance of getting what they want. And that's the kind of case in which it's more appropriate to talk about methods extremism. And of course, we also worry about whether the targets of violence are legitimate or not. So we distinguish usually between military and civilian targets. So extreme methods, extreme violence means using violence against illegitimate targets. And then there's the question related to Mandela's question, which is, was violence a last resort? Right, so Mandela's argument was that they tried nonviolence, so violence was a last resort. Extremists, on the other hand, use violence as a first resort. Okay, so these are some of the contextual factors that are relevant to determining whether the use of violence in pursuit of a political objective makes you a methods extremist. So I want to say the following. The archetypal violent methods extremist uses unnecessary and or disproportionate violence not as a last resort in pursuit of an unjust but hopeless cause and against illegitimate targets. Think of Timothy McVeigh blowing up the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 200 people. Disproportionate violence, yes. Was it a last resort? Certainly not. What was McVeigh's cause? Well, I mean, God knows what his cause was, but something about being against the federal government and worrying about his guns being taken away. A hopeless cause? Pretty hopeless. Bringing down the federal government of the United States seems like a hopeless cause. Illegitimate targets? Well, absolutely. What about the 200 office workers who were wiped out by him? So that's an example of a violent methods extremist. Another example of a violent methods extremist was Osama bin Laden. So here's bin Laden, famous quotation. as they kill us, without a doubt, we have to kill them being Americans, until we obtain a balance in terror. Did he think civilians were legitimate targets? He certainly did. As he said, they are not exonerated from responsibility for the actions of their government, presumably even if they didn't vote for them. So he says, we kill their innocence. That is valid both logically and religiously. So if you want to know what a methods extremist sounds like, that's what a methods extremist sounds like. That's the kind of thing that a true methods extremist says. The kind of thing that a methods extremist doesn't say is what Mandela says: violence was the only method that would destroy apartheid. Now, I mean, of course, violent extremists might say that, but the thing is, when Mandela said it, he was saying something true. Okay, so that's methods extremism. So it turns out to be a kind of complicated notion. Right? And the point I really want to emphasize is that the relationship between it and the use of violence is a complicated relationship. All right, so let's move on to ideological extremism. So what makes an ideology an extremist ideology? So I've talked about the idea of an ideological space, and I've talked about extremist ideologies as extremist because of their location in ideological space. Now we run into a kind of obvious complication, which is that ideological space has multiple different dimensions, like physical space, actually. So, of course, there's the left to right dimension. So in the middle of the 20th century, I think if people were talking about extremism, they would have talked about extreme left and extreme right. But these days, matters are more complicated. I mean, if you think about bin Laden's ideology, was it extreme left or extreme right? I mean, the answer to that question isn't completely obvious. I think there's room for discussion about how to classify it. And yet it was an extremist ideology. So that suggests that there is more than one dimension of ideological space. There's also the authoritarianism dimension, or the authoritarianism spectrum. So some ideologies that are at opposite ends of the left to right spectrum might be at the same end of the authoritarianism spectrum. So extreme left and extreme right ideologies are at opposite ends of the left to right spectrum, but they might nevertheless both be authoritarian. So they're at the same end of the authoritarianism spectrum. And of course, there's also the pro-violence spectrum. So some ideologies are keener on violence than others. So fascism, a classic ideology that has this almost sort of visceral liking for violence. So that would place fascism very much at one end of the pro-violence spectrum. So lots of different dimensions of ideological space. Another issue to take into account is that even if you look at a particular dimension, say the left to right dimension of ideological space, you then have the question, well, how do you figure out whether a particular ideology is on the left or on the right or in the middle? And if it's on the left, how far to the left? So I want to suggest that that is dealt with by testing the ideology with a menu of diagnostic questions. So if you want to figure out if someone's ideology is left-wing or right-wing, you'd ask them questions like, what's your view of private property? What's your view of human rights? What's your view of taxation? What's your view of the welfare state? And so on. So for each dimension, location along that dimension is fixed by answers to a menu of diagnostic questions. And I think this means that ideological extremism is relative in a number of different ways. So first of all, and most obviously, you're going to have dimension relativity. So where an ideology is, whether it's extreme or not, extremist or not, is going to depend on which dimension you're talking about. There's also going to be menu relativity. So an ideology is going to be left-wing or right-wing according to one menu of diagnostic questions, but given a different menu, maybe you'll have different answers. I mean, that sounds very abstract, but think about it like this. In the United States today, if you're trying to figure out whether someone is on the left or the right, liberal or conservative, one question you might ask them is, well, what's your attitude to gun control? or what's your attitude to abortion? Whereas if you were in the United Kingdom today, I think that the question, what's your attitude to gun control, wouldn't really be the obvious question to ask in figuring out people's political allegiances. So that's what I mean by menu relativity. Right? The questions that you use to determine where someone is on the left to right spectrum in America will be different from the questions that you would ask if you were talking to a German or a Brit or an Indian. And then, of course, there's historical relativity, which is the obvious form of ideological relativity, which is that what counts as an extremist position at one time, being against slavery, for example, or being in favor of votes for women, might be completely mainstream at another time. So political scientists like to talk about the Overton window. So the Overton window is, roughly speaking, the positions that are mainstream at a particular time, and the Overton window shifts. So ideological extremism turns out to be a useful notion, but it does involve various kinds of relativity. However, it's worth pointing out that ideologies that are extremist in the ideological sense are at least sometimes also pro-violence. So there's a connection between ideological extremism and methods extremism. So if you take fascism as an example of an ideologically extremist ideology, it's also a pro-violence ideology. So there's a connection between its position in ideological space and its conception of the appropriate methods for achieving political objectives. But it's also worth remarking, I think, that even ideologies that are not conventionally regarded as extremist ideologies may still be pro-violent. I think it's worth pointing that out. So even so-called moderate ideologies, or relatively moderate ideologies, may nevertheless, in a certain sense, be methods extremists. So if you think about the American neocons in the early 2000s, what was their attitude to violence? Well, I mean, they were pro-violence, right? Not pro-Al-Qaeda violence, but they were pro-violence in the sense that they had a political objective, regime change in Iraq, and they certainly endorsed the use of violence to achieve that political objective. And what's more, it was an objective that could arguably have been achieved in other ways. So it was elective violence. So according to my definition, that would make them methods extremists, and I don't find that an embarrassing result at all. And another interesting example was President Obama, a centrist figure, you would have thought, but Obama was a huge fan of drone strikes as a weapon of counter-terrorism. So one way to describe this is to say that Obama endorsed the use of drone strikes in a very extreme form of violence in pursuit of America's political objectives in the Middle East. Well, that's a kind of methods extremism, right? I mean, drone strikes kill a lot of people, including a lot of civilians. And so in both cases, violence was endorsed in the name of countering extremism. I think this brings out the fact that the connections between a person's position on the left to right spectrum and their attitude to violence are actually quite complicated. Obama seems to me to be someone who is more or less in the middle of the left to right spectrum, perhaps slightly to the right, but nevertheless someone who was prepared to resort to violence in pursuit of a political objective. All right, now on to psychological extremism. We talk about mindsets. So the classic text here is Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer, which was published in the 1950s. So this is Hoffer's famous description. Now, Hoffer talks about fanatics, not extremists, but it's basically the same thing. So Hoffer says, though they seem to be at opposite poles, fanatics of all kinds are actually crowded together at one end. It is the fanatic and the moderate who are poles apart and never meet. Right, so that's the Hoffer point. Fanatics of the left or the right or some other variety, they have a lot in common. The people they're really different from are moderates. Okay, and so in my terms, what Hoffer is really getting at is that extremists or fanatics of all different kinds have a shared mindset. So what do I mean by a mindset, and what is the extremist mindset? So I want to suggest that one thing that makes an extremist an extremist in the psychological sense is that they have certain characteristic preoccupations. So your mindset is partly a function of the things that preoccupy you, partly a function of the things by which you're obsessed. So one extremist preoccupation is what I call the purity preoccupation. So extremists are preoccupied with the actual or threatened dilution of their religious, their ethnic, or their ideological purity by powerful external forces. So here's some examples. So for example, ISIS is, of course, very concerned with religious purity, with the need to remove all so-called infidel influences from the Arabian Peninsula. The Nazis were preoccupied with racial purity, of course, the racial purity laws. And for an example of an extremist organization that was obsessed with ideological purity, you need to think back to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1970s. An extreme left-wing organization that wanted to be the purest and most unadulterated communists that was possible. Right? They thought that even Mao was too wishy-washy. Right? So that's an organization that is preoccupied with ideological purity. So the purity preoccupation, I take that to be one of the preoccupations that marks out the extremist mindset. Extremists are also preoccupied with their supposed victimization and humiliation by outsiders. Right? So this is the victimhood preoccupation. So think about incels, for example. So incel males are preoccupied by their supposed humiliation by women who won't go to bed with them. Right? That's a kind of extremely bizarre victimhood preoccupation. Right? And I think that extremist organizations are always banging on about their victimization, right, by some outside body, by the other. Now, of course, it's possible that they are being victimized, right? So that distinction needs to be drawn between cases where the victimization is genuine and cases where it isn't. And I think it's more natural to talk about the extremist mindset where people are preoccupied with fantasies of victimhood or fantasies of humiliation. So that's why incels would come out as extremists or having an extremist preoccupation on this view. Okay, so preoccupations are one element of the extremist mindset. Another element of the extremist mindset are a person's attitudes. So if I want to figure out whether someone has an extremist mindset, I'll be interested in the question, what are their attitudes? So here are some examples of what I take to be extremist attitudes. So first of all, pro-violence. They tend to be in favor of violence. They're against compromise. They don't care very much about the negative consequences of their actions or their policies. So they tend to think things like, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. That's their defining principle. Yes, of course, you plant a bomb in a pub, you're going to kill people, but that's just how things are. Intolerance, that's another one, of the religious, the ideological, or the racial other. They're against pluralism, and they tend to be authoritarian. Okay, so these are just different elements of the extremist mindset. Now, there's a lot to be said about all of these. I just want to focus on the case of compromise. I think compromise raises a lot of interesting questions. So one thing that people often say about extremists is that they are uncompromising, and this is what makes it appropriate to call them extremists. But you might think that that can't be right, because surely people who are principled are also uncompromising. Right, so what's the difference between simply being a person with strong principles, which you're unwilling to compromise, and being an extremist? So I think a very helpful discussion of this issue can be found in a book by the very great Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit. So he has a book on compromise in which he says the following. He says, political compromises, especially compromises for the sake of peace, are a good thing, as indeed they are. The compromises that are to be avoided are what he calls rotten compromises. So a rotten compromise is an agreement to establish or maintain an inhuman regime. So on Margalit's view, being principled does not require you to be uncompromising. It doesn't require you to be hostile to compromise per se. It simply requires you to be unwilling to make rotten compromises. Again, what counts as a rotten compromise, that's a deeply normative notion. Right? There's no purely descriptive way of figuring out what counts as a rotten compromise. So on this view, extremism, or the extremist mindset, is the disposition to view any compromise as a rotten compromise, as a capitulation, as a betrayal, right? So that's a very typical thing of that extremists say. Anything that looks like a compromise, they immediately reject as a betrayal. So here's a nice Margalit quotation, which I think captures the point beautifully. So what I'm calling extremists, he calls sectarians, but it's the same thing, right? So he says, in general, the extremist is in favor of purging and splitting for the sake of retaining the integrity of what should be kept pure. Like the Monty Python sketch, right, where there are endless splits and splits within splits and further splits. So Margaret says, shit is the negation of the pure. The sectarian craves life without shit. Whereas compromise, as we all know, is part and parcel of the shitty world. And that is what extremists find difficult. Those of us who aren't extremists just realize that compromise is part and part of the shitty world that we live in. Okay, so that's as much as I want to say about extremist attitudes. Another element of the extremist mindset are certain emotions. So anger, resentment, humiliation, self-pity, these are very much part of the extremist mindset. And there are also what I call extremist thinking styles. So extremists tend to engage in apocalyptic thinking. Think about ISIS, right? So ISIS, like a lot of extremists, are completely preoccupied with the end of the world, right? With the coming end times. That's a kind of classic apocalyptic thinking style, which is characteristic of many extremists. I think extremists also engage in utopian thinking, right? So they tend to think that, you know, the sunny uplands are just round the corner if only they got their way. And they also tend to believe that they can achieve this nirvana by acts of violence. And then, of course, extremists tend to engage in conspiracy thinking. They tend to be conspiracy theorists. Right? So what do, you know, fascists, a lot of people on the extreme left, and Al-Qaeda, what do they all have in common? They're all conspiracy theorists. Okay, I mean, you don't have to be an extremist to be a conspiracy theorist, but it helps. Okay, so I've now gone into the different varieties of extremism at some length. And I can now answer one of the questions that I started out with, which is, when we talk about extremism, are we talking about something real? And I hope it's now clear that the answer to that question is yes. So some ideologies really are extremist. Some ideologies really are at one or other end of a particular ideological dimension. I mean, of course, the notion of an ideological space, I mean, of course, that's sort of metaphorical, but that's not to say that some positions aren't to the left or to the right of other positions. So in that sense, I think when we talk about ideological extremism, we're talking about something real. What about methods extremism? Is that something real? Well, absolutely. The use of extreme methods by political actors in pursuit of political objectives, that is something absolutely real. Think about Putin's methods. So what is Putin's political objective? To destroy Ukraine or to reintegrate Ukraine into Russia? What is the method that he's employing in pursuit of that political objective? Extreme, extraordinary violence. That is methods extremism, regardless of what you think about the objective. So methods extremism is a real thing. And lastly, psychological extremism, is that something real? Well, yes, there are people who have an extremist mindset. There are people who have these various features that I've been just outlining. So the answer to the question, are we talking about something real when we talk about extremism? I think the answer is straightforwardly yes. I mean, of course, the label is used as a term of abuse. Of course, a label is abused. But from the fact that the label is abused, it doesn't mean that it doesn't pick out something real. I mean, for all I know, the North Koreans describe themselves as Democrats, right? That's an abuse of the label Democrat, right? But that's not to say that democracy isn't something real. It is something real. Okay, now for the last question, and I think the most interesting question, which is why not extremism? Go back to the question, to the Mary quotation in her exchange with her father. So here are three quotations which make the point extremely well. So the first quotation is from the introduction to a collection of essays on political rationality and extremism. So here's the quotation. As is widely acknowledged, we owe our political liberties today to some extremists of the past, and too much conformity is a danger to our intellectual life and to social progress. So think about the suffragettes. Many of them would have been regarded at the time as extremists. Some of them carried out acts of violence. But surely we owe the emancipation of women, at least to some extent, to the activities of the suffragettes. Martin Luther King Jr., so this is from his letter from Birmingham jail, great passage where he says, so the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? So there again, the idea that it's not that there's something wrong with extremism per se. What's problematic is being an extremist for injustice rather than an extremist for justice. And, he also talks about being an extremist for love. And then there's a third quotation from a political scientist, Joel Olson. So Olson is someone who's written at some length about the radical abolitionists in the 19th century in America. So this is the movement that campaigned against slavery in America in the 19th century. So Olson picks up on the point that some of them thought of themselves as fanatics for abolition. So in my terms, you might call them extremists for abolition. So this is how Olson puts it. The radical abolitionists were self-defined fanatics with an unyielding commitment to the immediate and unconditional emancipation of the enslaved. And Olson's question is, well, what's wrong with that? Surely this is an area where extremism is entirely appropriate. Well, this is a very kind of complicated and involved question, and I will just say a couple of things about Olson's claim. The first thing I want to say is this, that the abolitionists that he's talking about, the so-called radical abolitionists, did not, on the whole, use extreme methods in pursuit of their objectives. On the whole, they were non-violent. I mean, there were some examples of acts of violence, but by and large, they tried persuasion. Right? They tried persuasion. They actually had they had the idea. I mean, in retrospect, perhaps the touchingly naive idea that they could actually talk slave owners round, or at least some slave owners round. That's not methods extremism. I think it's also true that the radical abolitionists lacked many of the characteristic preoccupations and attitudes of the extremist. They were opposed to compromise with slave owners, but in Margolit's terminology, compromising with slave owners or compromising with slavery, that would be a rotten compromise. So the fact that they weren't interested in rotten compromises did not make them extremists. So I want to say that a better way of thinking about the radical abolitionists is to think of them not as extremists, but to think of them as radicals. And that brings me to the sort of last point, the last substantive point that I want to make, which is the importance of distinguishing between extremism and radicalism. Okay, so what is a radical? What's a radical? So here are some of the features of radicalism as I understand it. So radicals want fundamental change and they are opposed to gradualism. So a classic statement of the radical outlook is Greta Thunberg. So in one of her speeches, she said, I think she says this in many of her speeches, everything needs to change and it needs to change now. That's radicalism. Everything needs to change. In other words, we need fundamental, we need sweeping change, and it needs to change now. We need immediate change, not gradualism. Radicals, as I understand them, do not see all compromises as rotten. I mean, they see rotten compromises as rotten, but you don't have to see all compromise as rotten to be a radical. Radicals endorse the use of extra institutional means in pursuit of their objectives, so they might be in favor of strikes and demonstrations and sit-ins, media campaigns. They're in favor of all of that, but they only endorse violence in limited circumstances when there really is no alternative to violence. Radicals challenge the prevailing master narrative, and they question assumptions that are usually unquestioned. And the last thing to note is that radicals may or may not be progressive. I mean, there's progressive radicalism and there's regressive radicalism. So I would argue that Trump actually was a radical, is a radical, but a radical of the regressive, retrograde kind. Progressive radicalism is basically the radicalism of the radical Enlightenment. It involves a commitment to democracy and to racial and sexual equality. So that's radicalism. Now, if that all sounds like it's a nice package, it's intended to sound like a nice package. Radicalism is intended to sound as a positive thing, as distinct from extremism. So what is the relationship between radicalism and extremism? Now, this is a kind of complicated question, which is, I think, probably too boring to go into at any great length here. But roughly speaking, one view would be radicalism and extremism have some things in common, but the extremist goes further than the radical. A different view is that they are fundamentally different political kinds. They're just completely different kinds of thing. I mean, my own view is that radicalism and extremism do have some things in common, but they also disagree fundamentally about other matters. For example, they disagree fundamentally about the legitimate use of violence. They disagree fundamentally about whether it's possible for a compromise not to be a rotten compromise. So there are similarities, but also differences between radicalism and extremism. Now, why am I making such a big deal of this relationship between radicalism and extremism? The reason I'm making such a big deal of it is I think we need to have an answer to people like Joel Olson and Martin Luther King Jr. We need to have an answer to people who say that we owe many of our liberties today to extremists of the past. My response to that is to say, what history teaches is not that extremism has been the key to human progress, but rather that radicalism has been the key to human progress and human freedom. Too much conformity is indeed a danger to our intellectual life and to social progress, but so is extremism. Now, of course, conservative critics of radicalism like to confuse it with extremism. They like to label all radicals, all political radicals, as extremists. But radicals should not encourage this confusion by describing themselves as extremists. And I think when people talk about the so-called radicalization process as the process of becoming an extremist, I think that adds to the confusion. Radicalization is the process of becoming a radical, just as the word would suggest. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it certainly isn't necessarily equivalent to becoming an extremist. So what I want to suggest, and this is my parting thought, is that radicalism is often a good thing. Radicalism has been a good thing. It has given us many of our freedoms and liberties. And we should be grateful for that. And that is the point that people like Martin Luther King Jr. are making, and it's a good point. But we should not confuse that with the quite distinct point that extremism is a good thing. It seems to me that if you understand extremism in any of the senses that I've described, extremism is not a good thing. We should not be extremists, but we should perhaps be radicals. That's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Quassim, for that very subtle and compelling lecture. We've got time now for questions for Professor Cassam. Questions are already coming in. Please do put any further questions to Professor Cassam through the Q&A function on the screens in front of you. But the first question I'm going to relate to you, Quassim, does relate to that last section of your lecture, which is about your distinction between radicalism and extremism. And the question, in a sense, is following on from that, which is, would it help to draw the line somewhere for acceptable extremism, I suppose the implication, rather than using radicalism as the positive term. Similar, the questioner says, to what we do in positive secular law. Would it help to draw the line somewhere for acceptable extremism?
Well, I think at this point there's a danger that we're going to get involved in a kind of terminological confusion, because then if you say, well, acceptable extremism, you're then going to say what counts as an acceptable extremist. There's also then the risk of as it were, mission creep, that you start off with a form of extremism that you say is acceptable, and then, well, just a little bit more. Is it now acceptable? A little bit more. Is it now acceptable? I think it's just neater and more straightforward to say that, look, we've got two ideas here that are not unconnected, but they are basically two ideas: the idea of the extremist and the idea of the radical. And let's not encourage confusion about these ideas by using labels like, acceptable extremist.
Thanks very much. Next question says, many thanks for a fascinating talk. My question is, how should states respond to extremism?
Goodness. Well, I think a good start is for states not to be extremists themselves. I think that's got to be the absolute starting point. So if you think about methods of extremism, the use of violence in pursuit of political objectives, I mean unnecessary extreme violence, the biggest perpetrators of that kind of violence, of course, have been states. They've been responsible for far worse violence than any terrorist organization, and you see that in the world today. Now, I take it the questioner is really asking about how should states respond to extremist organizations or groups that are subnational, and I think the response needs to be very subtle. I think a lot of extremists have what I call grievance narratives. So they become extremists or sympathetic to extremists because they have feelings of grievance. And this connects with what I was saying about victimhood and humiliation. And I think a good place to start is, are any of their grievances legitimate? Are there genuine grievances here? If there are genuine grievances, the most effective way of responding to extremism is actually to try and engage with these grievances and to see if we can come to an understanding with these organizations. Simply dismissing their grievances as nonsensical or as fantasies is not going to be the solution if there's anything to these grievances. I mean, so incels are an interesting case, I think, because there it's very hard to see any legitimate grievance. Right? So that would be a case where my sort of somewhat compromising approach isn't going to work. But I think in most other cases, so for example, if you think about extremists based in the Middle East who complain about Western foreign policy in the Middle East, it's no good saying, well, of course, that's all nonsense. Our intentions have always been good. It's just not true, right? I mean, that's the sort of thing that the West needs to own up to and actually deal with and own. And unless it does so, it's really not going to have a convincing response to extremism. So there are just a few preliminary thoughts. I think it's an extraordinarily kind of complicated question. I think if we're talking about terrorists, that's a particularly complicated question. If you're talking about extremists who are not terrorists, well, you might think with them, there's no need for us to do anything, right? People can think what they want. It's a democracy, right? But once they start turning to violence, of course, we do need to respond to them.
And on your point about the Middle East, I remember in your book, you say that extremism is a response to political realities. And in some ways, if you're going to counter it, you need to respond to those realities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the prevent strategy, which I talk about, actually very interesting and in a way quite subtle document. But one thing that it doesn't really do is to do justice to the grievances that motivate the people that it wants to tackle. So when it comes to the policies in the Middle East, the prevent document says something like, we are not at war with the Middle East, or we're not at war with Islam, or something like that. Well, yes, I mean, of course that's right, but you also need to think about, well, why is the West perceived as being hostile to Islam? Is it pure fantasy, or are there historical realities that perception is responding to? And if there are historical realities, then we, the West, and not sure who I'm speaking for here, need to own these realities and respond to them in a sensible way.
Thanks, Quassim. Next question says, why do you term your thesis a philosophical analysis when it seems more empirical, if not positivist?
Well, so as I see it, a philosophical analysis can be empirical, or at least partly empirical, so I don't see a kind of conflict between the two. When people used to talk about philosophical analysis in Oxford in the 1950s, what they meant was something like, philosophers sitting in an armchair, breaking concepts down into their component parts. Now, there's a sort of bit of that in what I'm doing. I mean, I am, providing a kind of analysis of the idea of an extremist mindset, or an analysis in that sense of the idea of an extremist ideology. And the analyses I'm offering are, in a sense, based on what you might think of as armchair reflection. But they're not just based on armchair reflection. I want to test these analyses against the real world. So I think what I would want to say is, what I'm offering is a philosophical analysis, as long as you understand philosophical analyses as having both an a priori and an empirical dimension.
Thanks very much. Lots of questions coming in. Please do keep them coming in, and we're going to try and get through as many of them with Professor Cassam as we can. Here's another question for you, Quassim. Is there a categorical difference in the psychology of extremists indoctrinated through centralized organizational ideologies versus decentralized methods?
I'm doubtful about categorical difference. I think it's more plausible to say that these are differences in degree rather than categorical differences. I think even being an extremist is a matter of degree. There isn't a categorical difference between extremists and non-extremists. So I think I would need to know more about the two cases that the questioner has in mind. But just the term categorical difference makes me suspicious straight off.
Thank you. A couple of questions here which I think are addressing a similar issue, which is the relationship between the different kinds of extremism about which you spoke. First of them, I'll read both questions out. First one says, a thoughtful presentation, thank you. It seems psychological extremism can entail both method extremism and ideological extremism. Would you agree with this? And the other question, are the three varieties of extremism necessarily exclusive? On the face of it, at least, a combination of the two or all three appears to be the norm.
Yeah, on the second question, absolutely. I'm drawing a conceptual distinction between three varieties of extremism, but of course, in reality, they very often go together. So no problem on that front. On the first question, it sort of brings to mind something that I was thinking about as I was writing the book, which is, do I want to say that any one of these three varieties of extremism is the most basic or the most fundamental? And I am somewhat tempted to say that actually yes, and that psychological extremism is in some senses the most basic form of extremism, in the sense that being a psychological extremist it looks like the sort of thing that's going to get you to be an ideological or a methods extremist. Or to put it another way, being a psychological extremist is a kind of risk factor for being an ideological or a methods extremist. If you ask the question the other way around, supposing you start off as an ideological extremist, is that likely to make you a psychological extremist? Well, perhaps, but it does raise the question of how you came to be an ideological extremist in the first place. But yes, I mean, I can imagine perhaps that somebody becomes an ideological extremist through contextual factors or something to do with their upbringing, and then become more uncompromising and more fanatical, so they become more psychologically extremist. So I'm not ruling out that case, but if I had to say which of these is the most basic, I would say it's the psychological, which leads to and goes together with the other two.
Thank you, Quassim. Next question, could you say a bit more about the links between extremism and conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. So I think it is a kind of empirical truth that a lot of ideological extremists are conspiracy theorists. And I think it's a very interesting question. Why is that? What is the connection between them? And I haven't really got a kind of a fully worked out answer to that question. But I think there's something about the extremist mindset which requires the identification of an enemy I think that's a big element of the extremist mindset. And when you think about the enemy, it's people with this mindset then tend to think of the enemy as working behind the scenes, right, as working in secret. So that would be one way in which there's a connection between the two. I think it's also worth highlighting something which I highlight in my book on conspiracy theories, which is that a lot of ideological extremists are not just conspiracy theorists, they are anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Anti-Semitism I think of as the original sin of conspiracy theorizing. And it's very interesting that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example, one of the most notorious anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, is one that is still doing the rounds on the extreme right. And the last time I checked, it was cited in the Constitution of Hamas as if it was historical fact. Very interesting phenomenon. Now, what about the other way around? Can you be a conspiracy theorist but not an extremist? Well, yes. I mean, I guess there are lots of conspiracy theorists who I wouldn't want to describe as extremists. But what I like to say to people in that situation is be careful about the company that you're keeping here. Right? That actually, starting off with your supposedly innocuous, benign conspiracy theories, it is quite easy to get sucked into, to get drawn into the more extreme ideologies with which these theories are very often associated. And so I think of the fact that extremist ideologies tend to be conspiracy-minded as a kind of warning to the rest of us not to dabble with conspiracy theories without understanding the history and the extremely bad ideological company that they generally keep.
Thanks very much. Next question. What similarities and differences do you perceive between your analysis of extremism and just unjust war theory?
Well, so I'm no expert on just and unjust war theory, but I mean, certainly when I talked about the whole issue of a just cause or not, so I wanted to argue that the use of violence does not make you an extremist if the cause is just and various other conditions are met. So I take it that that would be a point of connection between my analysis and just and unjust war theories. I think, again, this is an opportunity to say something that I've said many times, but I'll say it again, which is the normative dimension of my analysis. I think there's no getting away from that. That's just how it is.
Thanks. A question which brings us back to states. As a layman, the questioner says, it feels like extremism is used for fringe non-establishment groups, e.g. I haven't heard Putin described as extremist, but certainly as fascist.
Well, I think that that's true. It is much more commonly used in that way. I would be all in favor of a campaign to start using the label extremist as a label for people like Putin. I think as I said in answer to an earlier question, the worst excesses of extremism have been carried out by states and the leaders of states, the Nazis, Stalin, extremist heads of state. And I think it would be healthy and useful if those of us who are interested in this topic, started to insist on using the label much more widely to describe, in a way, the worst extremists of all tend to be states.
Yeah, with much greater capacity to use it.
They have far more destructive power. They have all the nuclear weapons, right?
I mean, the next question relates to that as well, Quassim, which is there's a statement which the questioner then wants you to comment on, and the statement is, beware of the hero and superhero who use violence and extreme violence against the bad guys and are then cheered on by their own audiences. Comment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what that is getting at is something that's important. That while we might applaud the use of violence against the bad guys, the problem with violence is that it can be addictive. It can then end up being used well beyond the original circumstances in which it was used. And I think that's what this saying is saying. And I think it's right to highlight the dangers of applauding any use. I mean, violence is awful. I mean, one doesn't want to applaud the use of violence. I don't enjoy watching Russian tanks being hit by Ukrainian missiles, even though I think the Ukrainians are absolutely right to do what they're doing. But the fact is there are actual human beings in these tanks who are being incinerated and blown to smithereens by these missiles. So, and some of these human beings might not even want to be there. So I think we need to be careful, I think, and make sure we're not too bloodthirsty.
Thank you, Quassim. The next question says, many modern right-wing extremists mask their extremism, the questioner says, in irony, humour and plausible deniability. Many modern right-wing extremists mask their extremism in irony, humour and plausible deniability. What analytical and policy response problems does this pose?
Well, I think the main policy problem that it poses is that right-wing extremism has been far more politically effective, it seems to me, in Europe and in America in the last few years than not just left-wing extremism, but the left on the whole. And I think that those of us who don't like right-wing extremism, I think my sort of plea to those who share my views is to actually develop a proper strategy for dealing with these methods that are used so effectively by right-wing extremists. You think of the 2016 Trump campaign, highly effective use of all sorts of techniques and methods by people who I think are extremists, and they did it well. They won. And are we going to be back in the same position in 2024? Well, if not, we'd better think of something, think of some effective responses. Sadly, I just don't have the expertise to actually give you an effective response, but I think we should be thinking about this issue.
Thank you. Next question comes again to the relationship between the three different kinds of extremism which you discussed. Has Professor Cassam attempted to chart, for example, in a Venn diagram, these concepts to show how they interact and influence each other?
Well, I haven't tried to do it in the form of a Venn diagram, but I sort of tried to do it in my book, and I mean, I think what you'd find is that there is a sort of a core that is common to all three types of extremism, and indeed in a lot of historical examples, the three types of extremism go together. It's instantiated by the same organizations. So to take, I think, a relatively uncontroversial example, Al-Qaeda, I think, extremists in the ideological sense, in the methods sense, and in the psychological sense. To the extent that you can pull these apart, I think the pulling apart is in a way, this is where I'm a philosopher, it's a sort of conceptual pulling apart. Whereas in reality, I think these things are very tightly related. And they're also, aside from conceptual issues, there are also, there are causal connections between these different varieties of extremism, and that's something that I hope I brought out in my talk.
Thank you, Quassim. Next question says, thank you so much. Is a similar term for extremism derived from the etymological root used in other cultures and languages around the world?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I would imagine the answer is yes, but I couldn't. I'm not enough of a linguist to swear to it. But just confining ourselves to English, I mean, of course, there's the word extremist and the word radical, but there are two other words that are worth thinking about here, namely fundamentalist and fanatic. And one of the things that I actually found most difficult in the book, I think the chapter I least enjoyed writing was the chapter in which I tried to look at the relationship between extremism, fanaticism, and fundamentalism. And I think there are all sorts of very interesting connections to be traced just there, without getting into what other languages and other cultures. I think we have a very rich conceptual vocabulary here, actually, but it's not a transparent vocabulary, and that, in a way, is why, as a philosopher, I think I've got something to contribute to this.
I mean, the next question actually picks up on that and is about the relation between fanaticism and extremism. And the questioner says, if radicals are different from extremists, which they are, why are fanatics and extremists the same, as you've earlier suggested? I think that was the quotation where you were quoting someone saying fanatics.
Yeah. So I mean, in fact, I think that the relationship between fanaticism and extremism is actually more complicated. Is more complicated than that. I think it's possible to be a fanatic in some sense without being an ideological extremist. I mean, there are examples that I could give, but perhaps they would be a bit too controversial. But I can think of mainstream politicians who one wouldn't describe as ideological extremists, who certainly display a certain kind of fanaticism. So I think the relationship is complicated. another example, I mean, supposing you think of a fanatical pacifist. Right? I mean, is that possible? Is it possible to be a fanatical pacifist? Well, perhaps it is. I mean, perhaps that's an intelligible notion. But of course, a fanatical pacifist is not going to be pro-violence. They're not going to be methods extremists, unless you think of pacifism as an extreme method of achieving a political objective. So it's a messy area.
And to some degree, however unsatisfactory, the use of various terms, terrorism, extremism, radicalization, is they're the terms which we have, and therefore engaging with sophisticated analysis of them is presumably, in your view, worth doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that these terms are so poorly understood and so often abused, I think, is a good enough reason to actually try and sit down and, as I would see it, bring some order to the conceptual chaos.
Related to that, the next question says, do you feel that the notion of extremism has become overly pejorative because of its association with terrorism and Islamic terrorism in particular? Do you feel that the notion of extremism has become overly pejorative because of its association with terrorism and Islamic terrorism in particular?
It has become pejorative. I'm not sure I would agree that it's become overly pejorative. I mean, in my view, I think the use of the word extremist in those connections is legitimate. However, we do need to have an answer to the questions that were raised by the Martin Luther King Jr. quote and the Mary quote from the book. And my answer to that is to say, well, actually, we shouldn't talk about the good extremist. If in the cases that they're interested in, we need to use another label, and that is in a way because I actually do think that the label extremist picks out something that is undesirable. So if there's a pejorative use, that's fine by me.
One of the nice things about these mechanisms is you can get people writing in saying thank you for answering my question. So this is so people are able to respond that way. Next question says, could you say something about the way in which your framework helps us to understand the nature of the Taliban?
Yes. Now, that's a very, very interesting example. So let's start off with the issue of methods extremism. Are the Taliban methods extremists? Now, of course, a lot is going to depend here on whether you think that their cause is just or not. Now, that again is a complicated matter because, of course, you might not approve of their Islamist ideology, but supposing you think of the Taliban as an anti-colonial or anti-imperialist organization that was fighting to remove an imperial power from occupying its land. Well, if you spin it that way, it starts to seem like a just cause, right? And did they have an alternative to violence? Well, were the Americans just going to leave just like that without violence? Perhaps not. So whether you say that the Taliban were methods extremists or not turns out to be complicated because of these issues. Is there ideology in extremist ideology? Well, here you have to really engage with these issues of relativity that I was talking about. I mean, there's the history of the country, the region. Relative to that, is it an extremist ideology? Well, I think there are actually probably variations within the Taliban. I think there's more moderate and more extreme people in the Taliban. So maybe there isn't a straightforward answer to that question. Are they extremists in a psychological sense? Well, I don't know. I mean, there are certainly some elements of that are detectable. So that's a great question. It's a great example, I think, because when questions about extremism become entangled with questions about colonialism and imperialism, things start to get really, really messy. And of course, this has relevance to the Irish context as well.
And it's one of the potential benefits of sophisticated analyses is that if you ask that question generally in the West, are the Taliban extremists? People would say, of course they are. They're a paradigmatic example of it. And yet your argument tonight and in your book suggests that it's much more difficult to be precise about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so H.R. McMaster says in his recent book, Battlegrounds, he is highly critical of people who insist on distinguishing between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now, of course, if you can't really separate the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, well, I would say Al-Qaeda certainly are extremists by my light, so that would be an argument for treating the Taliban as extremists. What exactly is the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban is a matter about which others know far more than I do.
Thank you. Next question, Quassim says, how do we distinguish between truth and falsehood in the context of extremism? How do we distinguish between truth and falsehood in the context of extremism?
Well, so extremists make claims, for example, about their victimization or their persecution. I think we need to answer the question: are these claims true or not? Right. So think about Elliot Rodger. So Elliot Rodger, for those of you forgotten, was the young man who carried out and he basically murdered a whole bunch of young women who had rejected his sexual advances. So he was one of the earlier incel extremists. Now, Elliot Rodger had a narrative about his life and about the life of American young men and their persecution, as he saw it, their humiliation by these women on his university campus. So, were the things he was saying true? Well, no, they weren't true. I think the things he was saying told you far more about Elliot Rodger's extremely weird psychology than about the facts of gender relations on a university campus. So I think the question is a very important question, because we mustn't be shy about using terms like true or false to describe certain extremist narratives. Where they're true, we need to be prepared to say that they're true, and where they're false, we need to be prepared to say that they're false. And I think we should kind of get away from this idea that well, it's all relative or something like that. I mean, the incel example is a really nice example, because I think there just isn't a temptation to say that, well, maybe Elliot Rodger had a point. For those of you who haven't done so, you should watch the YouTube video of Elliot Rodger speaking to a camera in his car just before he was about to carry out his murderous attacks. Not a single thing that he said was true, although it was true to his weird psychology, which is a different kind of truth.
Thank you. Next question says, some scholars note that terrorist leaders are less extremist compared to their grassroots. Have you found this? If so, why do you think it is? So grassroots as opposed to leadership. Yeah.
So I'm not aware that is so. I mean, the terrorist organizations that I have studied, I wouldn't have said that the leadership is less extreme than the grassroots. I mean, what is true is that the leaders, of course, tend not to get their hands dirty when it comes to actually sending people out to carry out attacks. They'd much rather that someone else does it than that they do it. But that doesn't make them less extreme. But it's an interesting question. I think I would want to divert that question to a terrorism expert.
Thanks. Next question says, why do we generally emphasize extremism as a cause for violence rather than many other contextual causes that more significantly account for violent reactions?
Well, I think it's because it is a cause of violence. I mean, the question that we should be asking is among all the different causes of violence in the world today, how significant a cause is it? And that's a really good question. I mean, I would have thought that a major cause of violence in the world over the last 20, 30, 40 years, perhaps forever, is nationalism. So then you have to think about, well, what's the relationship between violence in the name of the nation, or nationalistically inspired violence and extremist violence? Are they the same thing? Well, sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. So I think extremism is something real. I think it is responsible for a lot of violence. However, if the point of the question is to say, well, let's look at other causes of violence, absolutely, I agree.
Thank you very much. Next question says this: I think that Professor Cassam's analysis will be very helpful for developing policy towards non-state actors. I think that Professor Cassam's analysis will be very helpful for developing policy towards non-state actors. Has he advised any governments on this?
Well, no one's asked me. But if there's anyone out there who would like my views, I mean, one thing that I actually do try to do in the book, in the last chapter of the book, is to look at the whole issue of counter-radicalization and de-radicalization. These are absolutely fascinating topics, and I try to use my framework to develop sort of strategies for de-radicalization, so-called de-radicalization and so-called counter-radicalization. I am kind of keen on the idea that writing this book is not just an exercise in satisfying my own intellectual curiosity. I mean, if it actually can make a contribution in any real practical way, I would be absolutely delighted.
Next question says, why have more philosophers not focused on extremism in the past in this way?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it is in a way it's a comment on the priorities of academic philosophy. It's a comment on the extent to which academic philosophy has become increasingly embroiled in what I think of as rather sort of abstruse, very technical questions that really make no sense to a non-specialist. And I think there's a slight sense of looking down on people who do applied work in philosophy. And I think I'm now at a point in my career where I just don't care. I'm just going to do the stuff that I think is important and interesting and not worry about its standing in the profession. But I do hope, and in fact that's why this book was commissioned by Routledge. I mean, I was approached by Routledge, by the editor of Routledge, saying, did you know that there isn't a single philosophy book on extremism? And I think there ought to be one. Will you write it? And I thought I would. And I hope that, I mean, I think I just scratched the surface with this book, and I hope that other philosophers will become interested, but I'm not holding my breath.
Thank you. Next question, Quassim says, do your varieties of extremism account for irrational and mentally disturbed extremism? Do your varieties of extremism account for irrational and mentally disturbed extremism?
Well, the whole issue of the role of mental illness in extremism is a very interesting and difficult question, as it is in relation to terrorism as well. I haven't really kind of gone into this, but just thinking about the case of terrorism, as I understand it, a lot of people who've written about terrorism have made the point that actually a lot of terrorists appear to be mentally quite normal. There isn't actually much evidence of terrorists as being mentally ill. Now, if that's right, and terrorists are extremists, then it looks as though that's going to count against associating extremism with mental illness. But this is an area that needs further investigation. And one of the difficulties with investigating is that, of course, if you're trying to design a study to test, various hypotheses, I mean, one of the problems with doing that, using my framework, is that you're going to have to define terms like just and unjust. And that's not the sort of thing that psychologists like to do in designing their studies. So it's a tricky one, I think.
Because of the time, this is going to have to be the last question, but I think it's a good one to end on. Did you enjoy writing the book?
I loved it. Of my 7 books, I think it's the one I most enjoyed writing, and that was partly because as I was writing it, I thought, actually, this stuff really matters. And I couldn't have said that about all my previous books, so that helps.
I think you could have said it about all your previous books, but it's a good way to end the discussion. We've had a wonderful session. I'm going to say 3 kinds of thanks at the end to bring it to a close. The first is thanks to the audience. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join this session. I hope that you'll look at our website at the Mitchell Institute and join further events, whether in person or online like this one. And thank you for all of the questions that you asked. Thank you to colleagues in the Vice-Chancellor's Office at Queen's and in the Mitchell Institute at Queen's for organising the event so well and for making it possible to have this very fruitful discussion. But in particular, for a brilliant lecture and a wonderful feeling of questions. I'm sure everyone will want to join me in thanking our lecturer today, Professor Cassam. Thanks very much indeed.